Yeah, I mean, you can see this a lot, particularly with discourses around young people and directed at young people. So there's been this very conscious attempt to go into the education system and to teach young people all these different words and these, what I call, not just me, but others who work in this area, what we call therapeutic vocabularies. So you're given a new vocabulary to make sense of your experience. And it's a vocabulary that's derived from the psi disciplines, as Nicholas Rose calls it, drawing on Foucault, that basically the language of diagnosis, and a very deeply individualized lexicon for making sense of your experience. And also, young people are increasingly encouraged to constantly self-monitor, to
Right.
constantly be aware of everything that may be happening inside of their minds and in their bodies and so on, and to think of that as the be all and the end all of everything, of experience and so on. I was actually just talking to a colleague at another university who is a philosopher and gives these lectures, a series of lectures on freedom and happiness, and then assigns an essay. What's more important, freedom or happiness? And of course, you want to kind of have like a dialectic or something there, like, well,
Precisely.
only when we have freedom can we pursue happiness, whatever that would mean to the individual. That's what I would answer. But he said, not a single one voted for freedom, not a single one. And actually, sorry, there was one American exchange student, and it was all just self-evident to them that, of course, the goal and end purpose of everything is happiness, an internal kind of, and defined as an internal feeling within the individual. And that's actually something that is quite rare in human history. Now, you can say, oh, well, the Declaration of Independence enshrined the pursuit of happiness, but that didn't mean like, okay, yeah, you're going to pursue happiness, and then in 10 years, I'm going to come back with a clipboard, and I'm going to give you a scale of 1 to 10, and you'll be about an 8 now. You're about a 5 now, you'll be an 8 then. No, it was a
Right.
signifier of an openness that hadn't existed before, that when you come here, you will be free from the bonds of feudalism, or peasantry and religion or whatever. You'd be free to pursue your own happiness. It means whatever it means, to the individual.
Precisely.
And so, but that kind of openness is gone now. This sense that you would anchor your pursuit of meaning in something beyond the self is gone. This is something that Chantal Delsol talks about in her book Icarus Fallen, where she says that throughout most of human history, people didn't live. People lived as though they were signs. They lived as though they were like half of something else. They were a signifier of a signified that was beyond themselves. And now the signified is within the self. You are a sign now, but before you were a signifier of something else. You were always half of something else. That's what made you an individual. Now it's within you. It's your pursuit of meaning. The end point of everything is within and inside the individual. And that, as I said, is something that that's not how most people live. Christopher Lasch says most people didn't live as though they had one life to live. They lived as though they were living their parents' lives and their children's lives. They lived as though they were attached to a kind of, or were holding on to a thread that the end of which was in the past and which stretched forward into the future. We don't live like that anymore. We are cut off from the past and cut off also from the future. And I think that what this does is it makes, and like coupled with this kind of encouragement, and actually it's reflected in this encouragement to constantly self-monitor and constantly look inside yourself for meaning. And am I happy? Am I happy enough? How am I feeling today? And so on. This becomes the be all and the end all of your existence. And paradoxically, that's unbearable. It's unbearable. That
Absolutely.
if your whole point in life is your own well-being, you can't but be dissatisfied, because you can't have a sense of well-being all the time, right? But if
No.
that's your goal, and it's always going to be thwarted, and you're always going to feel not quite right, not quite good enough. And that's the whole point, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole point. It feeds, there's an industry side to this too.
Oh, precisely. And that's the
Dependence
position
and
I take
perception.
from a young age. I said, this whole narrative, this whole position, the linguistic element to it perpetuates an entire industry, academically and otherwise, that people have a job in this position to facilitate this kind of narrative perpetually. If you're always in need of help and help's always there, well, it becomes cyclical.
Yeah, and I think, you'd mentioned, how does it affect you today? Well, one, you're encouraged to believe that the purpose of everything is in yourself, and therefore any threat to that is a threat to your whole purpose in life, right? So any
Yes.
threat to your well-being becomes quite inflated. But the other thing too, which I think is a little more insidious, is everything gets collapsed into a mental health problem now. And there are lots of really good examples of this just in our culture. But for instance, the UK former conservative minister for universities said that mental health is the biggest problem facing universities, bigger even than fees. And now I don't know if anyone knows
Hmm.
any recent history, but they didn't used to have very high fees in the UK, and they didn't have fees at all. But about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, they introduced £9,000 a year fees, which is pretty astronomical. I mean, for any Canadian listeners, it's like, I don't know how much would that be now, like $17,000 a year just in your tuition fees. And students were really up in arms about this. They protested, smashed windows, students got arrested. It was a really big deal. And now, if you look through mental health discourses, as I've been doing for this new book that I've been writing, you can see, like, I took a sample of these discourses, from which Sam Gima's comments were one of them.
Right.
But I was coding this sample, and I was coding causes. What are the alleged causes of mental health problems in universities? And after a little while, I couldn't separate the causes from a mental health problem in itself.
Hmm.
It was very difficult. So they would say, like, oh, there's a mental health crisis in universities because of this, this, and this. And then it just became, this is the crisis. These issues are mental health problems. And even when it doesn't, like, the supposed solutions of more support and teaching people about their feelings and to help seek and so on, even when these things don't work, when they're removed, everyone gets angry because we have no solutions, right? Like, you can't control fees, right? So what are fees then? We protested and we failed. So that's just a fact of life. So what's the problem? The problem is that it affects your mental health, right? And at least that seems more isolable. I can do something about that, can't I? Not really, no, because it just leads to an up, you encourage people to get more support for everything, and the demand just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. It doesn't come
Right.
down. But it seems like people are doing something. So Sam Gima's line was actually a really wonderful little trick because, he was basically saying, oh, all that really matters is mental health because
Right.
we're not going to do anything about this. Right. So what it does is it collapses every issue into mental health problem. Why are fees a problem? Because they're bad for mental health. And hey, you can go and do yoga on Thursdays. We got well-being Wednesdays now,
Yes.
and I can be seen to be doing something about it. And so these problems, we're encouraged to kind of accept that our sphere of influence is very small. It's just, inside your head. And even then, it's really out of your control. And it's something that you need to seek help for. And that as a good citizen, you should be asking for professional help for your feelings and so on, and for your experience of distress at living in the world, whatever it is that's causing you distress. That's where your demands should be, not demanding the lower fees, for example.
Right.
That becomes a sphere of influence. That becomes what people can do something about.
Right. And I was familiar with that, but not to the extent, and it is. It's very clever on their part. It's very clever to alter, change, morph the narrative into something that seemingly is advantageous, seemingly to all. That seemingly it's flowery language and something that, look, we're now. This is all about you. It's not about us. It's not about the feed. It's about your health. We care about you. It's a great way to turn the narrative to something, um, something that distracts, quite rightly distracts from the pertinent, the evident, and the important issue, to be turned into something that seemingly is mental health. And I mean, even the way it's used, that term, it's so pervasive, but at the same time, it's so much of an umbrella term where what isn't mental health?
Oh, exactly,
And
exactly.
I think that's the game-winning plan about it. It's everything and it's everything and nothing.
Mhm. Well, I mean, that's what people say about a lot of these discourses too. Like, this isn't the first one. There was self-esteem, the whole self-esteem movement in the 80s and 90s, and then there was
Right.
happiness movement, which morphed into the well-being movement, which morphed
Hmm.
into the mental health movement. These things, they get expanded to mean everything. When they mean everything, they mean nothing.
Exactly.
And then they kind of burst, and but once they're institutionalized, you've got all these people and all these departments all over the place who are just hungry for something new that's going to do the same thing. So they're, oh, we're not talking about well-being anymore, we need to talk about bliss. They've always got something. There's always some
Precisely.
new word.
And they become less and less, I'm thinking of George Carlin here, actually. They become less and less detached the more morphological they become. Well, happiness, well, I can at least have an abstract idea as to what that might be, for me at least. Moving up to well-being, what is that? It's so detached from anything that I even know what the heck it is. It's an abstract concept. It's so abstract where I can't even conceptualize what that ought to be, let alone is.
Well, that's exactly it. That was one of the problems with well-being. Happiness had the problem where it sounded really frivolous, and everyday people kind of felt like lay people felt like they had a sense of what it meant. And this was a problem because they wanted to professionalize it. Sorry, I forgot to turn off my phone. Um, I'll say that line again if you want to cut it out. I'm so sorry.
That's quite right.
Right. This was the issue that they had with well-being, because before it, they had happiness, which sounded a little bit frivolous. People, lay people had a sense of what it meant, which is an issue. If you wanted to say that there's a science called happiness, people will go, ooh, that doesn't seem right to me. Or policymakers would say, I'm here to bring you happiness. And they're like, no, you're not.
Right.
People felt really uneasy about that. So they would often, claims makers, people who kind of were organized around these concepts and wanted to, bring it into policy, bring it into schools, write books about it. They started to shift over to the language of well-being, something I describe in my 2015, 2016 book on happiness. And so they start talking about well-being. But, there's this pushback against that too, because people are like, well, what does that mean? And, the World Bank tried to take up well-being as their new kind of goal for development over wealth. And they created these reports in the year 2000 called Voices of the Poor, where they claimed that the voices of the poor are crying out for international organizations to focus on well-being rather than wealth. But of course, they never asked them whether or not they preferred well-being or money. And they had a lot of trouble describing to the people what the heck well-being was, because the people they were talking to were not versed in World Bank buzzwords, is a line from one critic that I've drawn upon in the book. So they, this was a problem. But I do think mental health, so then well-being starts to give way to mental health, which has its own rhetorical advantages. One, it's medicalized.
Right.
So it has this kind of sense that there's some sort of scientific validation to it. It chimes with the fact that health has become one of the last virtues and values in society on which most people can agree. Like, we can't really agree on like goodness or truth or anything, but we can agree that we want to be healthy, whatever the hell that means. It kind of speaks to people at a very basic level. It's like a floating signifier. You can kind of put whatever meaning you want onto it, even though in policy it might be defined in a totally different way. So mental health kind of speaks to that stuff, but you still have all those other signifiers too when you want to demedicalize. So they're always trying to do this little dance where people are like, where people get a little like kind of uncertain or suspicious when you start talking about mental health. They go, well, no, I don't really think this is a health problem. And they go, well, it's about your well-being. They can step back and fall on these more. I remember I was doing these I've been doing this project on mental health in universities, and my colleague who's doing the research with me, she said, oh, they're obsessed with holism. They keep talking about holism, these practitioners. And I was thinking, well, that's what they're doing. They're doing this medicalization, demedicalization dance, where on the one hand, sometimes they want the authority of medicine and to say, don't, this is, they want all the baggage of medicine. So if I called it a mental health problem, I remove responsibility from the individual. Say, don't worry, you're ill, it's not your fault. And the person feels really good about that. On the other hand, if you turn everything into a mental health problem, you are depoliticized, you risk depoliticizing things, you transform everything into, the realm of medicine, and people don't feel comfortable with that. So then they start using the language of well-being and holism and so on. It kind of brings in this like spiritual element.
Right, precisely.
So all these terms, they're rhetorically useful. How much they actually, I mean, they can accord with people's experience because they're this new vocabulary to make sense of the world. But there are lots of different ways that you can make sense of the world. And this one encourages you to make sense of the world in terms of your own individual feelings about a situation. And it places a huge range of social issues into the realm of health, and therefore deflects attention from the material world a lot of the time. And I know I have a tendency to go on, but I'm just going to give you one more example of this.
No, please do.
So I was doing this show on BBC called The Big Questions, where they have this like panel of people, all sorts of different people, and in the front row. And I was on there, and there was a policymaker who was the head of some well-being initiative in Wales. Somebody in the back row puts up her hand. The talk is about happiness. And she says, it's all well and good. You can talk about happiness and well-being and so on. But we in the Welsh valleys, we don't have jobs. We don't have decent housing. I can't remember. I haven't got, it's been a long time since I viewed the clip, but you can go watch it on YouTube. But it was really interesting because the woman, the policymaker, responded in this really hand-wavy way, where she talks for like 45 seconds. And by the end of it, she's like, so, what we're really, not having a job is so bad for your well-being. So what we're really concerned about, I think, is mental health. And we really need to really push for support for mental health. And the woman at the back's like bewildered, right? And she's like, well, yeah, I guess we do. And now, she wanted to have a conversation about jobs and housing. Now we're having a talk about how important mental health is. Right. Just this wonderful little trick that she did. And I didn't even think that her name is Sophie Howe, I think. I don't even think that she realized what she was doing. I don't think they do it consciously.
Right. No.
I think they actually don't have answers. And that's the answer that they do have.
Yeah. And, I am familiar with that clip too. And situations like that, I've been in situations like that. I don't know. Particularly, I find they don't adhere to me. I find it just more or less that gives me a headache to be in those situations. That is that is negative for my mental health. Those kind of narratives and situations I find. But I find it too within those, especially that example you gave, which is the prime example for my thought here, is there seems to be a particular dynamic of a class dynamic. Well, I'm at the top, helping you who you're so unaware. You're just so unaware what's going on, where I need to help you. You need me to help you, as if to say you are invoking the potential for victimhood and poaching the potential for being illiterate or uneducated or unaware of one's own physical health, as if to say that you personally don't know your own well-being, what it is for you, but I know your well-being. I know how you need to be helpful. I can help you and put you on this path. It's not really your job you need. It's not employment. And that's just a symptom of the lack of wellness you have. It's very it's insulting. It's horrifically insulting to the individual to say that you don't know yourself, and here's the pathway. Here's the path to wellness, the path to happiness. That's now going to make you be employed. It's now you may not get employed, but at least you'll be happy.
That's a really good way of putting it, because in Edgar Cabanas's and Eva Luz's book from, I think, 2019 and 2020, I can't remember, but a couple of years back, called Manufacturing Happy Citizens, one of the things that they say happens with this discourse is that, Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, you've probably learned, a lot of people learn it in high school,
yes.
or Psychology 101, basically says, you need to have your basic needs, your basic material needs dealt with before you can kind of go up the hierarchy to self-actualization and so on. And what they say is that what these wellness discourses or this happiness industry, what it does is it flips all that upside down, where it says, first, you need to self-actualize. You need to have all these higher things, and then you will reach the you'll reach your material needs. In order to meet your material needs, you must first meet your psychological needs. They flip the whole thing upside down. If you go all the way back to the German ideology, Marx and Engels, they have the famous line where they say you have to eat before you can philosophize. Now you have to learn to philosophize before you can eat. But here's the interesting thing that you alluded to at the last thing you said, and this is what I've been writing in my new book. It's not only that we flipped the pyramid upside down, we've lopped that new top clean off. You may never reach those material needs, you know, beyond your basic kind of needs. That might always be a struggle. You may always be insecure, but that's beyond your control.
Precisely.
The only thing that you can control is that psychological aspect. Increasingly, that's all we've got and all we're given. And I think that's what's going on here, is that not only have we flipped the relationship between the psychological and the material, we've slowly pushed that material right out of
Yeah,
our thinking.
yeah, completely.